Well, good morning and welcome to day 16 of our devotional series in the book of Philippians. We're in chapter 2. We're going to finish verse 16 and go on to verses 17 and 18 today. Last time, Paul encouraged the Philippians to live without complaining or arguing. And now he becomes very personal. These are very personal verses. He describes his own life in these verses as something being poured out for the sake of Christ and for the spiritual growth of others. And yet he doesn't speak with bitterness. He speaks with joy. And the key thought for today is a life offered completely to God is never wasted. And serving Christ with sacrifice can become a source of deep joy. Point number 1, Paul saw his life as an offering to God. So I want to go back to verse 16 because we didn't quite finish that verse last time. I'm going to read the whole verse. Holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I will have reason to glory, because I did not run in vain, nor toil in vain. But even if I am being poured out, verse 17 says, as a drink offering, upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with you all. Paul says, even if I'm being poured out as a drink offering, and that language comes right from the Old Testament. You know, a drink offering was poured out before the Lord as part of a sacrifice. And once it was poured out, it could not be gathered up or taken back. And Paul uses that picture to describe his own life. He's saying, my life belongs completely to God. You know, Paul was not holding back part of himself in reserve. His time belonged to Christ. His gifts belonged to Christ. His strength belonged to Jesus Christ. Even his suffering belonged to Christ. The Christian life is not merely giving God a portion of yourselves or ourselves. It's recognizing that all of life belongs to him. And there's a verse in Romans chapter 12, verse 1. It says, present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. So the question is not only, what can I give God? The deeper question is, have I given God myself, my whole being, my whole life? Point number 2, serving God sometimes costs something. And Paul's language in these verses is very honest. Being poured out suggests sacrifice. Serving Christ had cost Paul a great deal. He had lost comfort. He had lost his freedom and security. He had lost approval. A lot of the people that used to hold him in high esteem now despised him and wanted him dead. At times he had been beaten and rejected and misunderstood and imprisoned. And yet Paul didn't conclude that obedience had been a mistake. He believed Christ was worthy. Sometimes we speak of serving God as though it should always be convenient. But genuine service often costs us something, and it may cost time and energy and comfort, personal preference, recognition, convenience. Think of a parent parent pours energy into raising children. A caregiver pours strength into helping someone who is ill. A pastor pours prayer and preparation into people. A volunteer quietly gives hours that others may never notice. A believer forgives when holding a grudge would feel easier. What are those? Those are sacrifices. None of those sacrifices earns salvation, but they can become expressions of love for the Savior who gave himself for us. And obviously, sacrifice is not evidence that we have missed God's will. Sometimes sacrifice is part of faithfully walking in it. Think about a candle. A candle gives light by slowly giving itself away. As it burns, it becomes smaller, but the room becomes brighter. And, likewise, a life spent serving Jesus Christ may require sacrifice, but it also brings light to others. And Jesus said in Mark 8:35, "Whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it." Point number 3, Paul was investing in the faith of others. Again, in verse 17, even if I am being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with you all. He didn't view his suffering as meaningless. He believed God was using it to strengthen the Philippians, and his imprisonment encouraged their courage, and his teaching strengthened their faith, and his example helped them persevere. Paul was willing to be poured out because he cared about what God was doing in other people. And that's a beautiful picture of ministry. True ministry is not primarily about drawing attention to ourselves, obviously. It's about helping others grow closer to Christ. And a spiritually mature person begins asking, who can I encourage? Whose faith can I strengthen? Who needs someone to pray for them? How can God use my experience to help another person? A cup of water serves little purpose if it's just sitting on the counter, untouched. It fulfills its purpose when it is poured out to refresh someone who's thirsty. And God fills us with grace and strength and encouragement so that his life can flow through us to others. 1 Thessalonians 5:11, encourage one another and build one another up. Point number 4, sacrifice and joy can exist together, this verse shows us. That's one of the surprising things about these verses is Paul's response. He says, I rejoice and I share my joy with you all. He's being poured out and he's rejoicing. Those two things may seem contradictory, but they're not. We often assume sacrifice produces misery and comfort produces joy. But Paul discovered something deeper than that. Joy does not always come from preserving ourselves. Sometimes joy comes from giving ourselves to something that truly matters. A mother might be tired after caring for her children, but she's deeply joyful. It can be a labor of love. A missionary might surrender comfort, but still experience profound purpose. A church member might give time and energy to serve others and then go home physically tired, but spiritually full. There's a kind of exhaustion that comes from emptiness, but there's also a kind of tiredness that comes from having spent yourself on something worthwhile. And Paul knew the difference. And that really comes through in these verses. All right, point number 5. We got to keep going here. Christian joy is meant to be shared. Let's read the next verse. You too, I urge you, rejoice in the same way and share your joy with me. So Paul in verse 17 says, I share my joy with you. Verse 18, you share your joy with me. Christian joy is meant to be shared, and Paul does not want the Philippians to merely observe his joy. He wants them to join in it. And Christian joy is communal. We rejoice when someone comes to Christ. We rejoice when someone grows spiritually. We rejoice when prayers are answered. We rejoice when another believer remains faithful through hardship. And sometimes we help others rejoice when they have temporarily lost sight of hope. And that's one of the gifts of Christian fellowship. When my faith is weak, yours can strengthen me. When you're discouraged, someone else can remind you of God's faithfulness. And when one person celebrates God's goodness, joy can spread through the church. Joy grows when God's people share it with one another. Romans 12:15, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. The church should be a place where burdens are shared, and so is joy. So, my time is just about up. So, Paul pictures his life as an offering being poured out before God. He doesn't resent it. He rejoices because he knows his life belongs to Christ, and he knows his sacrifice is strengthening others. And he knows that nothing offered sincerely to God is ever wasted. And most of us will never experience Paul's imprisonment or the dangers he faced, but every believer can live with the same attitude. Lord, my life is yours. Use my time, use my abilities, use my experiences, use even my hardships. Let my life strengthen someone else's faith. And may everything I offer become an act of worship. The world often says, protect yourself, preserve yourself, live for yourself. Jesus shows us a better way. So this week, begin each morning by offering your day to God. Ask God to replace, this is so important, to replace resentment with joy whenever service feels difficult. We'll see you. God bless. Bye-bye.